I'm Shing-hon. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. I'm here with my colleague Sami from the Cyber Defense Agency, and we're here to chat about how exactly we got ourselves into this present mess that we're in and how exactly we're going to extricate ourselves. So, just going to start off by talking about why to do good science at all, just briefly, and then we're going to have sort of two perspectives. So I'm going to give sort of an academic's perspective about how did academia end up the way they did, and what can academia do to get us out. And then Sami will do the same, but from a program manager's perspective for funding agencies. So I think it's worth thinking about, we've been talking about good science all day long. Well, why is it exactly that we want to do it? And I'm going to break this into kind of the good and the bad. So on the good side, science provides a foundation for future innovation. Things like number theory, which were very esoteric and could be considered borderline useless many years ago, are now it now underlies all of modern cryptography, which of course is required for the modern internet. We couldn't do all the things that we do every single day online if we couldn't be assured of the security of our transactions. And I also want to point out that I think science is really about developing and improving procedures for finding predictive rules. And the better the procedures that we develop, the faster our understanding will develop. And the more understanding we have, the more we can innovate, right? The more we can actually take advantage of what we learn. But this means that this is a long-term investment. Since it's an iterative process, and you can only iterate so fast, you have to make this investment over the long term. It's not possible to just get up one day and say, hey, it'd be really great if we had a ton of science. Here's some money, let's go do this. Right? It's something that has to be developed over the course of time. As for the downside, well, cybersecurity failures cost us billions of dollars every year. Right? And part of the problem is that we don't understand the basic principles that underlie these failures. And if we don't even understand the basics, how exactly is it going to be that we're going to solve this problem and reduce the damage done by these failures?
I'm sorry, I have to challenge your assertion that we don't understand the basic principles underlying failure. Bad code is probably a starting point, but that seems a little bit strong to say we don't understand the basic principles.
Well, I would say that we don't have a very good understanding of the way the emergent behavior of these systems interacts, right? We have created all of these software artifacts, and we put them all together in the internet, which is essentially one big kind of hacked together thing that seems to work okay. But we don't really understand why it is that certain things happen in many cases. Right? That the basics are, I don't think we have that understanding. Yeah.
I would make a counter challenge to what Greg has said here. Because you can blame it on bad code, that's okay, right? And maybe bad code is one of the underpinnings of many of the failures we've seen. But why do we have that bad code, right? And so there've been, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, Les Hatton in the UK made a survey of what constitutes, say, safe code. And guess which one came out not at 0, but below 0? C, right? So, we persist in using C. So there's other things that, other questions that one could ask. Whatever language you use, there are mistakes that people are going to make. What is it about the particular language that promotes the commission of certain kinds of errors of programmers? So I would say that, in fact, we do not understand the basic principles, even behind bad code.
Yeah, and it's probably worth pointing out that even when we talk about bad code, there's an issue of what is the mindset of the developer when he writes this bad code, right? Do we have an understanding of why it is that people end up writing bad code? Is it just laziness? Is it maliciousness? Or are there other factors that we're not considering? So the other thing that I want to point out is that we haven't really seen any catastrophic cybersecurity event. And I would sort of say again that I don't think we understand really what such an event would look like, what the rules would be that would govern such an event. And I think that to prevent these events, or to at least reduce the probability that they occur, it would be a good idea to do good science, to make sure we have an understanding of how something like this could occur so we can prevent it. So I'm going to give now my sort of academics perspective on why it is that we got into this mess and how we can get out. And just a little bit about myself. I'm a 6th-year PhD student now in the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University. And as you saw this morning, I've been spending all my years at graduate school working on keystroke dynamics, which is a field that I would say has very little, if not none, no science at all. So I feel at least somewhat qualified to say why it is that we got this way and how to get out. So I like to think of academia as one big contest, where everybody who participates is inherently in the contest. And this is a contest because there are more academics out there than there are some good jobs that academics can get. And the objective of this contest is to improve your CV. And this is what really opens up doors and produces the opportunities. So how do you improve your CV? Well, you can do things like get appointed to prestigious positions, or be the editor of a great journal, or be appointed to the PC of some important conference. You can get a bunch of funding, but as Victoria mentioned, the big one is publishing papers. So that's what really makes a CV stand out. Lots of papers, and hopefully lots of good papers. And since academics love to think of ourselves as rational beings, it's in our rational self-interest to spend the least amount of effort to obtain the greatest reward. And I think part of the problem that we have is that we sort of have misguided incentives. So we're incentivized to publish as much as possible, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, being efficient is never, usually not a bad thing. But we're also incentivized to do things like breaking papers into breaking work into as many papers as possible, right? The so-called LPU, or least publishable unit. And here you can already see this is something where you're breaking apart your work, which means you're going to get more publications, which is better for you, but you're making it harder for everybody else to figure out what you actually did. And also, you're trying to do the bare minimum to get your paper accepted, right? This is the least effort part. The minimum, of course, is set by the reviewers, who are other academics usually. And I think the problem really lies in the fact that these bare minimum standards aren't good enough. And what does this all look like? If you hang around academics for long enough, or even probably a year or so, you'll hear people say things like this, right? Oh, the Oakland conference is in a month. Well, let's start working on something so we can publish it there. Or you'll hear people say, oh, well, let's just shop this paper around. We'll get it published somewhere. Right? Or let's just take the shotgun approach and send out as many papers as we can, as many conferences as we can, and some of them are bound to get in. Right? And to me, all of these kind of statements are really just about gaming the system. You're trying to get as many publications for yourself as possible with the least effort possible, but you're doing so in a way that is sort of at a disservice to the community at large. If you're only starting work a month before you're going to try to publish it, it's probably not going to be great work. If you're shopping papers around, you're kind of making an admission that your paper is probably not all that great, because you have to try to get a set of reviewers who are either ignorant enough, busy enough, or just don't have low standards so that your paper can get published. And certainly, if you're taking the shotgun approach, what you're saying is, well, if I just do a bunch of stuff, I'm bound to run into it's sort of a worse version of shopping your paper around. You're shopping multiple papers around all at the same time. Yeah.
So I'm not sure that this problem is due to the competition nature of academics. So I graduated in 2005. When I graduated, my advisor gave me the advice of how I get my tenure. That's actually, I come back to what Victoria just said about you should do this software release after tenure, but the advice I got was that you should actually create some research prototype and make it available. People will start to use it. That's how you get tenure. So it seems to me he was pretty successful, and that's how he got his tenure back then in Carnegie University. So it seems to me that the competition rule has changed fairly recently. So people start to count numbers or number of persons weight on the quality of the conferences instead of really read the paper and then understand the merit and evaluate based on the true contribution. So it seems to me that the problem is not the competition, it's how can the competition is run, or how much time people have to actually evaluate other people's work.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think competition is a good thing, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I think the incentives we're offering people in this competition aren't quite what we want them to be for the community to benefit the most.
I would argue the judging is a little bit off as well, which is why we have situations like number 2, which I think in some situations would be valid if, for example, you had we had the S&P anecdote from earlier where there was too much information in the methodology for reproducibility and they felt that was boring. But I know there's a number of other workshops, such as Laser, which wants that sort of information. So I feel like the shopping the paper around is primarily not so much because they're making judgments on a weak paper trying to get in, but they're hoping that the reviewers understand what they're trying to get across in their research, because we seem to have no base methodology for judgment quality, or quality of judgment.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the problem, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Is there any other?
Well, I would like the speakers try to get through their slides, and then we can bombard them with questions.
Okay. So in my mind, the big problem, it boils down to the fact that the bare minimum standards that work, they don't contain anything about doing good science, for the most part. And usually there's not even bad science in there. As John mentioned, this morning, this can cause a situation where researchers waste a lot of time and money building off of bad work. Right, John, I think you gave the example of formal verification of avionics, was it? Where a lot of people had spent a lot of time building off of work that turned out to be faulty. And it's also, I think, much harder to discredit bad literature than to stop it from appearing in the first place. Because as soon as something hits the literature, you sort of need a lot more counter evidence before you can dismiss it, rather than if you just sort of quash it at, during its review. And I'd also argue, and maybe this is a little bit of a controversial point here, but I would think that there's sort of a deluge of publications, and I think it's really overwhelming the academic system and what it's designed to handle. And the reason I say that is because there is this competition to try to publish a lot, and so a lot of people are publishing a lot, and some of the people are taking these kind of, gaming approaches to try to, shop their papers around or to take a shotgun approach. And when you do that, it becomes very hard for editors and for PC chairs to find competent reviewers for all of the papers. And now you have a problem where you end up with people who are reviewing papers who aren't spending enough time to actually thoroughly understand what the paper is about and to figure out whether or not it's good work. And oftentimes what I see is that, well, you have a professor has a bunch of reviews, you just offload it to the graduate student. And so now you have graduate students who are who are potentially in their first or second year, trying to write these reviews. And you really now have kind of a poor reviewer for that particular paper. And I think the solution is also kind of pretty simple, at least conceptually, is to say, well, what we need is fewer higher quality publications. What we need is to raise this bar so that the minimum standards involve doing good science. And I view this as sort of a counterweight, that there's a pressure on every academic to go as fast as possible, right? To publish as much as possible, to make as much impact as possible, right? Go, go, go. And then we sometimes forget that there's supposed to be a competing pressure, which is, yeah, you should also do excellent work, right? And sometimes that gets lost a little bit because we're trying to publish so much, because we're trying to go so fast. And I think the problem that we have right now is that we're out of balance. We're putting too much emphasis on going fast, not enough on the high quality. So that brings the question up, right? Well, why aren't the standards higher? Well, I think there's 4 reasons. The first of which is a lack of education. And this, to me, is kind of a troubling problem, that I think science is not really on the curriculum in graduate school, at least not in computer science. And I think we have what I call a generational problem, where you now have advisors, the teachers, supposedly, who never got taught when they were in grad school how to do good science. And as a result, they can't possibly give this knowledge that they don't have to their students. And so now you have this cycle of ignorance in a way. There's also kind of a standoff problem, a stalemate problem, that despite how much we think double blinding of reviews is so great, the truth of the matter is oftentimes these reviews aren't actually blind, and if you tried hard enough, you could probably figure out who it was that reviewed your paper, or you could guess just by the language used, or because there's so few people in your field. And that means that if I, as a reviewer, raise the standards for you, and I anger you because I've kind of trashed your paper, or been overly harsh on your paper, well, now you're going to find out who that is. You find out that it's me, and then next time you're reviewing one of my papers, well, I'm going to suffer for that. And at the end of the day, if we're doing this tit for tat, we'll suffer. But everybody else who's not being held to these higher standards is going to have a lot more success. A third problem is that we don't have any written guidelines. And I mean, there's been some discussion today about consort and related types of guidelines for how you ought to publish data and how you actually ought to conduct science. And I think one of the problems we have in computer science, at least, is that we don't have really anything to point to when people ask us, well, okay, so I'm on board, I want to do science. How do I do it? Right? I don't think there's anything we can conclusively point to and say, oh, this is what you need to do. And finally, and maybe a bit embarrassingly, nobody's making us, right? Ultimately, researchers need funding. And if the funding agencies don't tell us that we need to change and don't apply some external pressure to us, we have little motivation to change. So in terms of addressing each of these issues, I think the first thing is, obviously, well, to address the lack of education, well, education is a great solution. And I think it ought to be mandatory training for anybody going through a PhD in computer science to know, well, what exactly is science? Why do we care about doing it? How do we do it? Right? And then also to say, well, how do we think critically about research? Not just our own, but also others. And how do we communicate our research to others? The old saying that research not communicated is research not done. To break the stalemate, I think what we need is to have an investment of academic capital in sort of a parallel to political capital. That it's really irrational in many ways for junior academics to risk raising the standards. Because, as Victoria pointed out, that, well, if you're going to try to do all this stuff to make your code available, to make your data available, to go through all these sort of extra steps that aren't required to get your paper published, you could potentially damage your career by not outputting more research. It's those who have this academic capital, right, the senior people, like the deans of universities or department heads or tenured faculty, right, the full research professors. They're the ones who can really stand up and say, look, we've been working at this for a while. I don't think we're doing this the right way. We need to shift. And even if it were to backfire, their standing, in a way, is not in as much jeopardy. Their careers aren't at risk if they take a stand. As for guidelines, I think it would be great if we had a checklist for what constitutes good science. And I understand that what constitutes good science might be different in different areas. And I think we need to apply this checklist, these guidelines, to the criteria we have for hiring decisions and tenure decisions, to make sure that it's based on the scientific quality of the work. And I think also the guidelines will have an added advantage of helping to foster a culture of cooperative scientific work. Because when I think about some of the reviews I've had to write and the review forms that I've seen, I get asked questions like, what is the intellectual merit of the work? Is this work novel enough to merit a publication? And oftentimes I sit there and I go, well, I don't really know what constitutes novel enough. I don't know what constitutes enough intellectual merit. I think if we had these guidelines, we can say, okay, well, what we're looking for in a piece of good work is A, B, C, and D. And then you look at the piece of work and you say, I see A and B, I don't see C and D, so I think, as my feedback to the author, you ought to do C and D, right? It gives us some framework with which to give feedback to others. And I think as a trade-off for doing all this, better scientific work, and I kind of touched on this earlier in some comments, I think we need to lower the expectation on the number of papers. And maybe this is really just a perception issue, right? Maybe the number of papers that people perceive that you need to have, maybe that's not really reality. but it's certainly the perception. And that's, maybe we need to just change the perception. And finally, to kind of give a little segue into Sami's part, I think we need some changes in the funding agencies, because ultimately they set the standards. Researchers are beholden to their funding sources. And if we're told that the target has moved and we need to meet this new target in order to get funding, we'll do it because we have to continue doing our research. But we have to be careful not to raise the standards too quickly or to move things too abruptly, because you don't want to yank the rug out from under researchers. I mean, a lot of hard-working researchers have sort of sadly been doing the wrong things, not because of malice, but because they were never taught the right approach to take. And if we're going to ask them to take a new approach, we need to be accommodating of the fact that we don't alienate them. And finally, I would say that I think the current funding cycle inhibits scientific work. That the funding periods that we have now, which often are 3 years or 2 years, even sometimes 1 year or 6 months, right? These are too short. They don't really match the graduate student life cycle. And that can often put professors in a rather awkward position about whether or not to undertake some new work, because they might have to take on a new student to do so, but then they have to find funding for that student for the remainder of their PhD. And then finally, I think it would be nice to have a year-round funding cycle, not just once a year. And I think this may be a little bit more of an NSF problem, where certain niche areas, you can only submit once a year because that's when the deadline is. And that means the feedback, your ability to incorporate the feedback that the reviewers give you is on a yearly basis, right? And you can imagine that by the second or third go-around of this, of submitting a proposal, being rejected but given some good comments, and then improving a proposal, well, the graduate student might have already gone, or the professor's interest might have changed, and now this work just won't get done. So I think to have something like a 6-week or 2-month or even 3-month funding opportunity allows people to iterate much more quickly on their ideas for their proposal. So having said that, I will turn it over to Sami.
Well, I'm not sure what the
I'm a little
protocol is.
confused though. Are we allowed to ask questions, or are we saving till everyone's done
I
talking?
just want to make sure Sami has time to do the slides.
Why don't we let Sami answer that question?
Yeah, so what I would suggest is that we're sort of trying to tell a complete story here. And so if we could hold for urgent questions, I don't get that point, so we'll take those, but we've allowed enough time at the end to have discussions sort of that cover both the academic and the program manager perspective, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Sami Saydjari. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a recovering program manager. I've invested your hard-earned taxpayer dollars from both National Security Agency and DARPA. And so I'm giving both the perspective from the investor's perspective, at least from my experience. So why don't funding agencies do something about this, right? Well, part of it goes back to Shing-hon's presentation, which is that these agencies are made up of academics and research engineers from the very same community he's talking about, who have the very same biases, right? And so they're deciding these same things, and they're using very, very similar standards. The other thing, which I'll talk about, I think, in the next slide a little bit more, is these agencies are under extreme pressure to show short-term results due to the gravity of risks that we're facing now and the shortness of program manager tours. And that in particular, I'm talking about DARPA. There's a unique challenge of the right engineering science mix in studying the synthetic space, right? So a couple have talked about sort of the hard sciences, right? But one interesting thing about computer science is we generate the artifacts that we study, right? And so you have to engineer those artifacts as you do the science. And so it's a complicated trade-off between investing in building these artifacts and investing in studying these artifacts. Next, these funding agencies are really not accountable to do science. If they don't do science, if they don't encourage science, there's no consequence. At least there's no near-term consequence. The consequences are long-term. And then there's steep cultural barriers, which I'll talk about. So this is just a look at how things have changed over time. And so in the 1960s, you had the space race, and you had the formation of DARPA, where the charge was very simple: avoid technological surprise. I think that is the best mission statement of any government agency anywhere, right? And DARPA would invest what it took in the long term to get stuff done. And in the 70s, again, we had 10-year investments to create things like the internet. The internet was not created overnight. Al Gore did not do it overnight, right? So it took a long, long time, and you had to create cross-disciplinary research, which takes a decade, as did Stealth. And then in the 80s, you had VLSI, VSIC, and you had a big surge of money. And this is sort of the era of the formation of this synthetic space called cyberspace. But something started happening in the 90s, particularly the late 90s, is research became shorter and shorter term and more military focused. There was a big surge in cyberspace commerce, which created a large incentive for people to leave academia to go make their millions, right, the dot-coms. But in red here, what you see is we also had an increasing number of conflicts that had to be funded. War, right? Desert Storm, and then in the 2000s, Afghan war, the Iraq, war on terror, war on drugs. We have a war for every occasion, right? And these wars are bleeding us dry in the research community in two ways. One is they're forcing the research to become nearer term, and second of all, they're actually taking money away from doing the research, and because we're having to buy bombs and bullets. And so there has been a trend, I think, and some pressures that actually dissuade the government from doing good, solid, long-term science. So I made this point about the somewhat confusing landscape for the investor, right? I mean, I talked about the research investor, the sponsor. Cyberspace is purely synthetic, and you have to construct these artifacts to study. Sometimes these artifacts are very, very large and complicated, requiring very sophisticated engineering, supercomputing, internet, cyber ranges, SCADA. These are very complex environments, requiring sometimes millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to create the environment to then do the study, right? And so it becomes confusing from a sponsor's perspective. Is the engineer in the lead, and are we creating lots of widgets, or is the scientist in the lead, and are we creating widgets to study for the scientists to study? And so there's a bit of that, right, where the science takes a second seat to the engineers. So as Shing-hon explained, from an accountability perspective, we've yet to experience a catastrophic cyberspace failure. And so there is no accountability for the lack of good science, right? Because the lack of good, I mean, if we have a failure, it's partly due to a lack of good science. It's also due to a lack of good engineering, right? But a lack of good engineering can be due to a lack of good science. But we haven't experienced this yet, right? And so why change things, right? Commerce is going along okay. We're still, competitive in the market. So why change, right? Well, partly is we're increasing the probability of a catastrophic failure, but we don't know it, right? That the clock is ticking, but you haven't experienced it yet. And so the incentive to do better science is not so obvious to the sponsors. When failures happen, who's going to be blamed, right? It's not the engineers that built the systems on the shaky ground, because they did the best thing that they could do. It's not the funding agencies that didn't invest properly, right? Because nobody's really going to think about to trace it all the way back to that. And it was not the academics, right, who were complicitous in this whole thing, right? So there's just nobody to be accountable for the catastrophes that we're weaving right now in this time. We have this attitude that systems have become so complicated that nobody can understand them anymore. So why try, right? And so, we can take small chunks of the problem, but nobody gets it, and so everybody kind of puts their hand up, which it's an attitude I've definitely seen in lots of communities in the investment side. So who's accountable for a devastating attack on a known vulnerable infrastructure? All right, we know that there's a problem. We know fundamentally that it's attackable. We talk about this every day. When this happens, who's accountable? Right? Is it academia? Is it the funding agencies? Who is it? Right? And the problem is it's none of us and all of us, right? And we have to change. So let me just talk a little bit about, there's a very interesting book called Naming Elephants, which has a very strange title, right? But it's a really good book on a culture that happened at NASA, where they were not able to name the elephant in the room, right, which is the probability of a launch failure. Right? The engineers weren't even allowed to discuss it. It was 1 in 100. The answer was 1 in 100,000. Right? Now what's the question? Right? So it had to be better than this number, and anybody who challenged that number was a threat. Right? And they had NASA leadership come in and talk about better, faster, cheaper. Right? And there's an interesting thing that happens when you, because there's nothing wrong with better, faster, cheaper, right? It sounds good. Of course I want things better, faster, and cheaper. But the culture of NASA before that was safety first. And what happened was that the culture of safety first got displaced by better, faster, cheaper. Right? An engineer would say, hey, I'm worried about this thing where the heat shield comes off and hits the wing, causes a dent, and maybe will cause failure on reentry. And somebody says, prove to me that's a problem. And the engineer says, well, that's why I need $50,000 to do the study to prove that's a problem. Well, prove to me it's a problem, then I'll give you the $50,000, right? And because it's better, faster, cheaper, right? Give me the ROI, right? So it's a very pernicious thing that happens over time, and that's one of the reasons why I talk about this trend over time is we've had a culture that has changed from fundamentally solving the deep problems that enable good engineering to getting stuff out as quickly as we possibly can. So if we look at DARPA, for example, which is an entity that I'm very familiar with, we're now in the area of quad charts and 18-month midterm exams, right? And we're not in the business of long-term building knowledge, or we're less in that business. I'll say that. Decisions of program managers who displace their careers to come to DARPA to try to change the world, their decisions are constantly second-guessed, right? Or at least they were under a previous administration. There was a tremendous pressure toward big companies with solutions that are already in hand because people are dying on the battlefield. We got to get things like, I recall at DARPA, we have IEDs. We got to solve the IED problem. People are dying. You're seeing body parts in the news. Stop it. Right? Stop the bleeding. Take $1 million in that program and stop the IED problem. Not that the IED problem is not cool, interesting, and important, but it displaced a whole bunch of other stuff, right? Because we're at war, right? So we have a decade long of short-term expediency, right? Get this done. This culture of short-term expediency and investment will take a very, very long time to change because it's at least a 6-year process because everybody who's there is optimized for this kind of investment culture. And then we create a PI community that's optimized for that investment environment, and which explains some of the mess we're in. All right, Sammy, you complained about this for a while. What do we do? I have a few suggestions of a way forward. One is create standards for good science, and Shing-hon has already sort of talked a little about this, and so did John this morning. But my viewpoint is that we have to get this standardized. We have to have the criteria that gets baked in to all of the criteria we use to judge things. Right? What gets measured gets done. So we need to help government, industry, academia bake them in. We have to offer up specific changes to the journal and conference paper review forms to include looking at aspects of science, right? So Shing-hon was talking about these review forms that says, is this novel enough? Well, that's not the right question. If somebody has repeated and affirmed somebody else's research, that's important. That's an important paper, right? So those questions aren't the right questions. But if we come forward and we say, here are the right questions, is this scientifically founded? Did the person document their approach? Do they have software? Do they have repeatable data, repeatable processes and the data to back it up? If we ask those questions, then the reviewers will answer those questions and it'll change how we do things. I think that was an immediate thing that we can do to make things a whole lot better. And then the same sort of thing, I've reviewed probably 10,000 proposals in my lifetime, my career, and not a single one of the forms that I filled out said, is this good science? Right? That's bad. And I'll admit guilt. I was a program manager, and I didn't bake that in. I mean, I could have, right? But I didn't, right? But now I understand better, right? And so baking these things into the criteria will be a first good step in this direction. Way number 2, look back from the future. This gets back to the accountability problem. So we can kind of look forward and forecast some of the possible disaster scenarios that might result from the lack of good science, right? Some of us in this room can sit down and think about this. And then we could hold a mock congressional hearing to look backward, right, in this pretend projected future and ask what went wrong, right? So what I don't want to have happen is actually be in this congressional hearing, right, about why the U.S. economy collapsed 5 years ago and how we fix it. What I want to do is have a mock one of these things to talk about, all right, what was the shaky science that led to this shaky engineering, which led to this brittle cyberspace, which led to this catastrophe? I want to have that as a conversation now and not wait until the catastrophe happens, and then talk about how we need to change things, right? What do we need to help people understand how to do these changes? So my personal viewpoint, those who know me understand that I believe we're headed for a cyber disaster here. And I believe that the lack of good science is a significant contributing factor to that. And if we change our course, we can reduce the probability of such a disaster. Way forward, number 3, we need to seek good science leadership in our government positions. So there are people here who have grown up with no science, and they think it's okay, right? Those aren't the people we need in our leadership positions, right? So we have to have people who appreciate science, understand what good science is, being in positions like director of DARPA, director of the various funding agencies. Writing to the search criteria for these positions, what we look for in good science, right? So that their CVs have scientific experience of the type that Shing-hon was describing in sort of his mandatory list of 5 or 6 bullets that be in the background of anybody who's doing PhD work in computer science. And then so lobby through DARPA, through NSF, and other foundations like that to give them a charter to improve the science, right? It has to be in their marching orders. You need to make the science better. Way forward, number 4, change the funding model, right? So I have seen the damage, right, that the 3-year funding cycles, which really aren't 3-year funding cycles, they're 18-month funding cycles. We pretend they're 3-year funding cycles, but you have the risk of having it cut off after 18 months. I see principal investigator after principal investigator spending all of their time chasing new proposals and not doing any science. We cannot afford that. We have to change that model. DARPA in the earlier years didn't do 3-year funding. Right? They did 5-year block grants, right? And sometimes they did 10-year block grants, right? To MIT or CMU or to Berkeley, right? And so careers of graduate students can be formed around this. Another point that former director of DARPA made to me one time, he says, look, you know, if you want to create a cross-disciplinary change like material science, which he was involved in formulating, you can't expect people to try to cross-publish in a journal where this whole investment's going to last 2 years, right? There's no point in that, right? It's got to be like a 10-year investment in order to induce scientists to sort of cross boundaries from their discipline. Let's see, possible. Yeah, and so, and then Shing-hon made this point about making sure that the number of proposals isn't like, you know, have to do 5, 6 a year. Okay, so let me go to the next one. So teaching science now. We have to train the next set of people coming up. And Shing-hon made the point about graduate school, right? But, you know, we have an immediate need, right? And so picking some of the top students and bringing them to a series of workshops that teach them how to do science would be a valuable step. Just, you know, 2 days teaching material, practice, giving them giving a short talk on sort of the scientific approach that they would use for their problem. Just teaching them how to do this. Panel of judges to critique and improve. And then have these top graduate students go back to their home universities, back to their research institutions, and proselytize these methods, right? So this is something we can do right now. This is not a 5-year program. We could do this tomorrow if we chose to do that. Have special conferences where the prize for the best scientific paper is a significant chunk of money and some freedom to go pursue your research. And so that's really, really important to jumpstart graduate students in the academic community, but we still also need this in the professional community. And so you could do this professional workshops for example, people who are doing research sponsorship, you could do the very, very same thing in a very similar format. This we can do tomorrow. And so, what we talked about is sort of there's a spectrum of change that we need to institute, right? And so Shing-hon and I have talked about sort of the professional workshops to affect the professionals, right? Both the investors and the PIs themselves. Graduate students are sort of, we're investing in 5 years out. And if you look at post-Sputnik launch, right, there was a massive investment in science and technology and a great value placed on that because we understood what the space race meant. And I think ultimately our investment has to go down to K through 12 as well, right? But so there's a lot, that's obviously 20 years out, right? But I think we need a spectrum of investment over time. So what I'll do now is summarize the points that both Shing-hon and I made from two different perspectives, and that'll sort of kick off the conversation. So I don't think the community is failing because they want to, right? Everybody's trying to produce good results, but we are missing the mark. Moving at internet speed and continually to change the directives and the directions that the agencies have with short-term engineering at the expense of long-term research is killing us. We have to change that. We need to incentivize fewer higher quality publications so that the academic and the judging panels aren't overwhelmed and we can get better quality results. We need, as I mentioned, detailed standards for good science, both in the evaluation of papers and the evaluations of research proposals. We need to educate across the spectrum, K through 12, undergrad, grad professionals, on what constitutes good science. We need to start that today. We need to change the funding model to lengthen grant durations and permit many funding opportunities a year, not just one, so that there isn't this one event that if you miss, you're going to miss it for a year. And this will facilitate the better scientific research. And lastly, we need to remember that good science, it's an investment in the future and will spur innovation that will be very, very important for us, for the engineering world, and also to reduce the probability of a very, very serious event in the cyberspace that we depend so heavily on. Okay, so those are the two sets of points, and now Shing-hon and I will take questions at the spectrum of everything we talked about.
Okay, I actually want to ask a question.
Sure.
I haven't yet today. Can you go back to your way forward slide number 1?
I can.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So your first point, what gets measured gets done, and measurement is one of my hot buttons. We know that if we don't measure the right thing, we're not doing the right thing, right? So we need to figure out what to measure. And you and I both come from a background working for DARPA, and I know a lot of other people in this room have done DARPA-funded research. And for many years, the model was that program managers had to produce a set of metrics that would be approved by DIRO, and then these metrics would get applied to the entire program, and then an independent evaluator would come in and would assess all the different participants in how well they met those metrics. This went on for at least 8 years, maybe longer. So the question for you is, I guess maybe for both of you, do you think that model worked? And if not, how would you change it?
Wow, that's a deep question. So I'll say briefly that I thought a lot of those metrics were hokey, right? And they were just developed because somebody had to develop a metric. And so I don't think that it substantially changed the landscape of how things were done. I like the concept of it, right? Yeah, we should have good metrics, and we should hold people to those metrics, and we should judge them, right? But I think it was done in a manner that was not scientific, right? And so it did force programs into doing weird things that really weren't what they're supposed to be doing, right, to meet the metrics that somebody just made up one night when they go, oh, the metrics are due tomorrow. What can we do, right? No, I don't think they were successful, but I think they can be if we did a better job of thinking about what the right metrics are. And Laura, are you picking? Yeah, I'm just happy for you to pick the people. Then.
Never go first.
couple of observations and then something you may find a little amusing here. One of the factors that I think you omitted, which I believe is a very serious one, is that there is increasingly a political mindset in some circles that funding research is not the government's job and not the government's business. Having spent decades getting industry out of doing research funding, now there's a group of people that thinks that it's industry's job and not government's job, and that is affecting the dollars that are available, and thus acts as a stopper for any reforms that you might want to do if it takes any further hold. I had a number of experiences reviewing proposals primarily for NSF, which have been extremely disheartening, because I have never seen an NSF proposal that had a recognizable scientific component in it. And yet when I rated them as not fundable because I couldn't find any science, I got royally chewed by a number of NSF program managers that both you and I know. The upshot is that I'm no longer invited to review NSF proposals, which helps me. I say that to those of you who would like to be in that position. This is the way to do it on there. The third thing is I found your mock disaster remarks very interesting, and I just happen to have on my laptop these slides for Campaign Dark Angel.
Exactly. Yes. So great comments, John. I just want to comment on one of on the first thing you said, right? Because there is an element that thinks that research shouldn't be done by the government, but I think there is still a substantial number. You know, there are investors who are definitely willing to do that, and so for those that are, we need to figure out how to optimize that investment for science.
So I guess what I would say is that the purpose of government, in a way, is to do things for the common good that kind of doesn't make sense for any one individual or any one institution to take part in. And oftentimes fundamental research, especially looking in the very long term, falls exactly into that category. That, you know, like I used the number theory example, where this was, you know, why were we bothering to fund this? Not because there was any immediate practical application of this, but because we thought it would be a good idea just to, you know a little bit about this. And of course, lo and behold, it turned out to be very, very important. And I think, you know, given that it's very difficult to predict the future, it's important that we have sort of a broad base of research that, you know, perhaps in topics that aren't currently considered the most mainstream or, you know, the hottest topics, just because you never know what might be the most critical thing to have tomorrow. And if you don't start today on it, you won't have it tomorrow.
I have found this presentation to be a little confusing to me. I'm a social scientist, so that's probably got to be a big part, or at least a small part, because this seems to be a very computer scientist discussion. But I have to say that, like, there's some very surprising discussions. There's no good science checklist, and I can't imagine there's no good science checklist in social science either. It says you check all these boxes and your study is good and your paper is good. There's no government to tell you what science is supposed to look like. That's your field's job. That's my advisor's job. That's what the other academics' job is to do. And I'm finding it very strange to hear that, like, it's a perspective that it's the government's job to drive that instead of it's the academics, your job as academics to drive how well your grad students are trained, how well your undergrads are trained, what they know, what they submit. And I just found it a very backwards conversation from what I would expect, and just throwing that out, or even the 5-year funding cycle. So I do a lot of basic research right now for the federal government as a not-for-profit at MITRE. I never get 5 years of funding, and no offense to academics that sit on their funding and don't produce anything in 5 years. So I produce much better work in my 3 years or 18 months than I would if you gave me 5 years. And I get, you know, we're more expensive than academic institutions, but we're producing better stuff. And I don't think having more time is necessarily going to buy grad students doing better work. So kind of just, I don't know that really answers the question that making it a 5-year funding cycle means you're going to get better research out of there. Quality of the research isn't always driven by time. It's the quality of the methods that you're doing and the what you know how to do, not just the time it takes to do it. And so I just wanted to highlight that it was kind of a very strange panel, and I noted all sorts of things that seem at the root of the computer science field is the problem, not all these external things that now seem to be pointed to as the problem with the field of computer science then about good science, as if it's this mysterious thing, but checklist seems like a really kind of a whiny thing to ask for, to be honest. And I don't know what an alternative is, but I can't even imagine what any of my advisors would say if I went to a social science conference and said, I want a checklist for what good science looks like. So I know that sounds kind of mean, but I just find it a little strange that there needs to be, I don't know, a different kind of discussion about it, but I don't know if this is going to make a lot of progress for you.
Well, just to respond to the checklist comment, maybe that wasn't the best term to use. What I was kind of trying to suggest there is a list of sort of best practices and best procedures to operate under. And it wasn't necessarily suggesting that the government or anybody else should step in. It's obviously an academic problem. It's your field's job to decide what exactly constitutes the best procedures and best practices. But I think it's important that whatever we decide as a field that these practices are, they ought to be written down and codified so that other researchers who are new to the field can come in and say, oh, okay, I can see here's the kind of thing I ought to be doing, understanding that you might have to deviate a little bit from it if you're doing something that's not quite what was intended or what the authors had in mind when they wrote down this list.
You were just saying the government should incentivize the community to do what you just said.
Yes.
But the empirical method exists. It's not like, I mean, that's the foundation. You got to talk before about reproducibility. I mean, a lot of this isn't new. And I feel like we're discussing like as if it's all new. And it's not new.
But Deanna, you were brought up in a culture where they did exactly what you are talking about. And in computer science, it's not that culture at all. Right? That's the problem.
We have to change the culture.
Yeah.
So I have a comment here.
We have a long line of people.
Right. So we talk about metrics, right? And I feel metrics is the problem. There should be no metrics. And there is something called the Goodhart's law, which essentially says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. Because people start to game the system to optimize on your metrics or whatever you want to measure, as opposed to the real quality of the work. So as has just been pointed out, it's not a really new thing. It's just like, it's basic honesty or integrity. It's not hard to see this is not good science. But by not doing it, as you have observed, people measure your credential by the number of publications appearing in those top conferences, and that's the wrong thing to do. People should be saying, this person does really nice work because it does fit, as opposed to saying, oh, this student has 3 papers in Oakland, 2 papers in CCS, so he's a good, or she or he is a good student. So I think having any metrics is detrimental.
So let me address that. I don't agree, and here's why. So a metric that says that a paper has to have a well-stated hypothesis, a technical approach, and has to be reproducible. Maybe that's not a metric in your mind, it's a metric in my mind, because it's a metric that goes on the standard when I review a paper for Oakland, right? I'm going to look through and I'm going to measure the paper against these qualities, right? And I don't think that those qualities discourage good work, right? They encourage the reviewer to incentivize the right things in the paper. So I understand your point. What gets measured gets done to the exclusion of all else, and pokey metrics, like I was referring to in Laura's question, are very bad ideas, right? But there are good metrics, and we should find them and we should apply them. And I think the ones that Shing-hon and I mentioned about setting standards in paper and proposal review are good metrics that we should.
Yeah, I think this is a good guideline, but I think it's dangerous to form anything as the target that everyone has to adhere to. Because then people only look at those things, but then always overlook something that's really important for a particular case.
Gotcha.
And not be captured by those fixed checklists or whatever.
Gotcha. Laura, you want to go to the next question?
I guess that's me. I think it's related to these other questions. I know a lot of tenure and promotion committees, and I think even some NSF programs are turning towards an impact, right? So instead of counting how many publications are coming out, people are even asked in their own materials, how do you, give us an idea about the impact of your work? And I don't know if anybody has any good ways to evaluate that. We don't even know what are the high impact journals and conferences, and it's just another way to represent a metric. I just wanted to throw that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of comments, Sami. One is the quality of and the process by which programs are formulated in government circles. If you look at DARPA or DHS or NSF, typically you will have an academic or someone come in, gets about a year to formulate a program. They might form an advisory board, which is again mostly a lot of academics. And the problem with this is that this group is never really in touch with the end user community that could benefit from the research. They've never really gone into the trenches and talked to the soldiers or gone to a battlefield kind of scenario. So, okay, what are the real problems these people are really facing? So that's one issue. And that process could be improved. I think this whole question of whether it should be a 3-year cycle, a 5-year cycle, a 10-year cycle. Some problems require 10 years. Some problems may be okay in 3 years. It will become a lot clearer. And the other comment was just from my own perspective as a DARPA and THS and NSF PI, is that PIs get very little support. I mean, there's no ecosystem which actually gets the PIs in touch with the end user community that's going to be using the fruits of the research. Often, basically program managers are extremely busy, but there's no mechanism to get the PIs in touch with the people so that the problems can be formulated well and the solutions are really, really scalable and addressing real problems. It's often PIs end up making cartoon problems and solving these cartoon problems and getting a couple of papers and they're happy. But they're never really in touch. So everybody, even from the government side, people who are potential users of research products, they need to be incentivized to work with the researchers. So somebody in a government circle should get promoted because they give good ideas and the research got better. And the other thing is that often PIs are interacting with COTRs. Often COTRs don't have the technical background. So there's really that whole innovation management process is just not there. It's the famous cartoon that you've seen all the time, with DARPA, is that basically they fund research, but then they just throw it over, right? That whole tech transition and innovation management process is just not there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, actually, DHS is working on that. We can look for this year. Or has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, this is a comment about guidelines for research, or guidelines for good research, or however you want to interpret it. So I sense in the room maybe some fear that the government is going to come down and tell you how to do your research. But I don't think that that's the intention of these so-called guidelines. So let me just take an illustrative example from a different funding agency that most people in the room may not be familiar with, and that's NIH. So at NIH, they do a lot of work that involves human subjects. And there's some issue about just how many subjects you need in an experiment in order to get statistical validity for your results. So this is a concept called power. Now, the issue with this is that if you include too few subjects in your study, you might make a mistake and have a conclusion which isn't really true. If you include too many subjects in your study, then the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake is small, but you spent money and other resources that you didn't really have to spend. So what then would be the right number of subjects to have in your study? Well, this can be figured out, and my point here is that NIH decided that if you send in a proposal and you did not say how it was that you arrived at whatever number of subjects you proposed, you're done on the spot. You're out of the running. And that is the kind of guidance that I think that people are talking about when they say maybe there ought to be a checklist of some of the important things. It's not that anybody's telling you what to do. They're just telling you, here are some important things that you ought to pay attention to.
Okay, so, I don't think it makes any difference whether you're doing research for pure science or mission-oriented research. I think that in all of these cases, you need to have some methods, established methods, metrics, and methods where you can evaluate the validity of your results. And so I disagree with the comment that metrics are bad. Of course, bad metrics are bad. And in my experience, looking at situations such as what was described for a period of maybe 8 or 10 years, I don't know if it's the case now, but I thought when DARPA originally began requiring metrics, I thought it was a great idea, but I can understand why it didn't work out. And the problem, I think, in the computer science community, we don't, well, I shouldn't say we, because I'm not one of you, but I don't think there's sufficient education of computer scientists at the PhD level, because I'm not sure that you need one as a bachelor degree person, but I think if you're going to be doing research, then there ought to be required courses in research methods. I was a physics major at one time, and we certainly got our share of research methodology and practical experience in the labs. And as a psychologist, experimental psychologist and cognitive psychologist, I got plenty of that. And so I think partly it's a cultural problem. What I found in interacting with various programs was that even when there was requirements for doing evaluations and building metrics, the people who were pretty much in charge of the projects, whether they were computer scientists or program managers or whatever, they didn't have that background, and so it really couldn't succeed.
Well, Frank mentioned taking courses in research methods, and I think that's a good thing to pay attention to. But I want to make a connection between research methods and the things that Victoria talked about. So Victoria talked about reproducibility as a way of stomping out error. And research methods is exactly the same thing. It's a guard against making mistakes.
Last question, then we need to break.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a question, I have a comment. I felt like the portrayal of academia and computer science was a bit negative and fatalistic, and lots of the people in the room are older than me, so this is for the few that are younger, so comment more that, well, even if you're on 10-year track or whatever your career path is, you should remember that you don't live for your CV, you have a life, and you need to decide what is important or not. So I'm on 10-year track, and I have a 3-year-old kid and 1-year-old kid. Those are the most important things to me, and I have decided that in my group we try to do the best work that we can, and we publish accordingly. So sometimes we don't succeed, sometimes we do. I may or may not get tenure, I don't know. So it depends on quite a few things. But so you shouldn't just look at the, well, I have all this external pressure to do things. Well, you might have that, but you also can decide on your own what you can do. I can give you one example, that one thing that we published just 3 weeks ago, we worked on it 4 years.
All right, so I know it was a comment, but I want to respond. My intention was not to be fatalistic, but realistic about the state of the practice and optimistic about a number of things that we can do to change things, right? But I think Shing-hon and I are both trying to be realistic about the nature of the problem, why we're there, and how to get out of it, right? Not just to sit up here and whine, right? I think we have some very serious problems that are really going to be a barrier to doing good science, and so we're trying to be helpful. That's my goal. Shing-hon, do you understand?
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing, that we're, in my mind, we're in a pretty serious situation. We're in a bit of trouble because we're not doing, we don't have good practices that will enable us to do good research. And so in my mind, the problem is, okay, well, I see where we are now. How do we get to a spot where we have these good practices and we're able to do better research?